Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, I have to admit my life is a bit in upheaval right now because I just moved out of my apartment that I've been living in for the last 7 years. Still very much involved in setting up my new place. My last few weeks have been just sort of consumed with this whole process, and so I haven't had time to fully prepare for another interview to give you all. And hopefully soon I will have for you an interview with Holly Ordway about her wonderful new spiritual biography of J.R.R. Tolkien. But in the meantime, I thought I'd give you, yes, indeed, a clip show. Highlights episode with some great clips from 4 past episodes. I always enjoy going back and listening to these, and perhaps some of you haven't heard these before, and so maybe you'll want to go back and check out the whole episode when you hear some of these clips. And so I will link to the episode from which all of these clips come in the show notes for this episode. Just to give you an overall preview of what you're going to hear, there's an interview with James Matthew Wilson, a poet and philosopher, about the role that stories have in the meaning of our lives. There are a couple of clips from my other podcast, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. One of them is from an interview I did with a Thomas More scholar about various criticisms that some people have made about the accuracy of the play and the film A Man for All Seasons, and particularly their portrayal of More as this kind of hero of conscience. And there's also a clip from our discussion of the classic Western film Stagecoach with Anthony Esolen. And finally, there's a bit from my interview with an Oratorian priest, Father Guy Nichols, who wrote a book about the aesthetics of St. John Henry Newman. Okay, so the first thing you're going to hear is about 20 minutes. I did a series of 3 episodes with James Matthew Wilson about his amazing book, The Vision of the Soul. This is an excerpt from the 3rd episode, The Vision of the Soul, Part 3, Reason with Stories, Philosophize with Your Life. And in this, James discusses story as the form and the meaning of a human life, and how modernity does not look at stories as a means of communicating truth.
Story is the form of a human life. And so the essence of your life is not 1 or 2 abstract principles to which you give credence. The meaning of your life is the full structure of your life, with its beginning in birth and its end in death and everything in between, that all go on to constitute form. So you say, what is the meaning of your life? And you say, well, it's the form of my life. Well, what's the form of your life? Well, it's the story that will be told from birth to death.
You mentioned the quote from, I think it's Solon.
Yes.
Call no man happy until he is dead. And that's repeated throughout the Greek plays as well. Euripides ends a lot of plays with that, call no man fortunate until, his life has come to a close. And that's one way of saying, wait till you can see the whole form of the story to make a judgment.
Yes, we could sum up the argument of the vision of the soul just by focusing on that phrase, actually. Nietzsche quotes it in The Birth of Tragedy, and he quotes it truthfully. Silenus the satyr says, call no man happy until he is dead. That's the secret of life. And it says, short of that, the secret of life is never to be born. Modern disenchantment wants to propose to us that life is fundamentally meaningless, and that it has no purpose, no telos towards which it's journeying, and therefore it probably would have been better, all things considered, never to have been born. But if you're born, there's a bunch of things you can do to occupy the while. And so then we settle into a kind of nihilistic form of Epicureanism, going from pleasure to pleasure, never letting it add up to anything. It's just a series of quantities. Whereas, in fact, just a few moments reflection shows us that indeed all the little parts and sensations and experiences of our life do add up to something. They build upon one another, and they instruct us in the nature of things. And before long, we discover that we're walking somewhere, that we're pursuing a destiny. We're going on a journey. We're not merely moving. And so, in fact, the form of our life is a story of our journey towards the truth. And so, in that light, Call No Man Happy Until He Is Dead reveals a further truth, and one that's quite the opposite of what Silenus had whispered in Nietzsche's ear, that our life is a preparation for our death is a part of our life, and all of it taken together is the complete journey towards meeting the one who made us. And so you can't call somebody's life happy if he had all of this great fortune, but he died in some ignoble fashion where he discovered or revealed that everything he'd ever said was a lie, that all he'd ever done was defraud people. Nobody would say, well, but he had it good, for 80 years of his life. And so the fact that this comes out at the end doesn't mean he had an unhappy life. No, to the contrary. Nobody would wish to be that man. No one wants to live a life where you, as it were, just get away with it.
Mm.
We want to be made whole. We want people to be able to look back at the form of our life and say, this was a glorious life, not because he appeared to be glorious or great at this or that moment, but because the form of the life as a whole shines forth as communicating some kind of fundamental truth, some kind of beauty.
It's not as though moderns have abandoned stories. In fact, we're probably as addicted to stories in the form of entertainment or whatever as anybody has ever been, any people has ever been. But perhaps that's precisely because we sort of have lost hope that our actual lives can be meaningful stories. Why is it that modernity abandons story as a means of approaching the truth? And what do we lose in our ability to reason because of that?
Well, so the most important part of any response to that question has to be what we lose is the ability to arrive at the truth. That we, as embodied rational creatures who dwell within our own story, can never be rational or can never act rationally if we don't acknowledge that all of our reasoning takes place in the context of a mythos, that logos takes place within mythos, even as mythos often enters into logos. We can't pursue the error of rationalism that tries to cut logos off from everything else and still be rational. So in that sense, and everybody knows this now, when you read the modern philosophers, whether it's Descartes or Hume or Kant or Hegel, this was a familiar and, in fact, very unhappy experience for early 19th century and early 20th century thinkers like T.S. Eliot. They often observed that the modern philosopher was really good at critiquing the follies of some other modern philosopher, but then when the philosopher would try to establish his own positive doctrine to replace it, it would always end up in absurdities, perhaps even worse than the predecessor. So we go from debunking implausible answers to big questions to providing a new positive doctrine for those to answer those questions. And those positive doctrines seem as insufficient as the ones they've replaced. And so that leads to misology, to this just despair of reason. One of the reasons for that is this rigid separation of logos from mythos. We need to be thinking of reasoning as always taking place within larger wholes, the whole of the human person, the whole of the human person's life, the whole of truth, the whole of God's revelation to us, the whole of being, etc. But there's another problem. So we're addicted to stories, but we come to think of stories as distractions from the truth to make life bearable, as opposed to one of the means of attaining truth. And we tend to think that if something's a story, then it probably can't be true. So that, I remember asking a classmate of mine why he didn't believe in God. And he said, wouldn't it be nice if it were true? Well, sure, it would be nice if it were true. Everything that's true that is in that sense nice. It fulfills us, it feeds us to know the truth. So of course it would be nice if there were a God, because nothing could feed the intellect more than the infinite banquet of contemplating him. But the cynicism of that, the thought that because something has a form that makes sense to us, because it seems like it's a story, because it seems too good to be true, that's actually kind of an absurdity. Why would anything be too good to be true? It just makes no sense to me. And so that leads to a further problem called psychosis. Depression, despair, And I mean the diagnosable kind that the psychologists talk about, psychiatrists talk about. It usually entails a person
Did you
seeing,
say you do mean that kind?
I do mean that kind.
Yeah.
Psychiatrists and sociologists will often note that people who suffer from severe forms of depression, where they're not really perceiving the world accurately, that you can see that they have a distorted perspective on what the world actually is, those same people usually have difficulty taking the granules of the chronology that is their life and seeing how it adds up to make a story. So for them, life is just, to use an old phrase, one damn thing after another. It never adds up to a whole. I think the reason that they're despairing is not because life doesn't add up to a whole, but rather their despair, their dismay, their disorder is the inability to perceive these wholes. In contrast, the person who tends to be flourishing, who tends to have a sensation of happiness, tends also to be someone who can perceive his life as unfolding in a series of chapters, stages, an intelligible quest moving from someplace towards something. So to go back to your early discussion of, do we know God or do we love him? Well, the answer is both. Well, human life tends to be an act of knowing that becomes more lovable the more we know of it. Human life tends to be more lovable the more we know it as a story, because stories are the forms of our lives. So it's not just philosophers who go awry by trying to separate logos from mythos. It's all of us. Our lives depend upon being able to be perceived by our being able to perceive them as a kind of story.
It also seems like this connects to some of our modern day political ideologies that reject the contingent, because any story has to involve the contingent. I mean, the rejection of the nation, for example, is a rejection of story fundamentally.
Yes.
It never is, because they always have to replace it with a story that, that makes the founding of the nation into some kind of sort of abominable act. They have their own stories, of course, because you can't get away from it. But
right.
You know what I'm saying.
I do. Yeah.
But is there an answer to why modern philosophers did abandon this?
Yeah. I mean, it's so amusing. Descartes' single best known work is his Meditations on First Philosophy. But he has the two great works, the Discourse on Method and the Meditations on First Philosophy. And both of them, in their own way, are narratives, but they're narratives about not needing narrative. Stories about not needing story. The story about getting rid of all of the contingent and all of the narrative elements of a human life until the mind, unaided, unassisted, and unsupported by anything but itself, stares at the presence of clear, distinct ideas. Now, Descartes gets something right. We're all questing to be staring at the truth, that's for sure. But we get there by way of a journey. And his philosophy was trying to cut off that journey. Why was he trying to do it? Well, I think because he wanted to lower the horizon for what reason actually had to accomplish. He makes all kinds of superficial gestures about the beauties of the contemplative life and the contemplation of God. But it seems pretty clear that that's not the game that Descartes' really after. What he wants is a much smaller quarry, to discover the mechanics of the body so as to be able to improve health and extend the lifespan. Why? Well, because to be alive is better than to be dead. Well, why? He has no answer to that, except for rhetorical ones. Oh, contemplating God would be nice. But he's not really interested in that. He's really trying to just reduce the horizon of reason so that it can be fully repackaged as a useful tool for the gaining of mastery over our bodies and the material world as a whole. And, well, that's the story that the modern age tells itself. There were these benighted people who wasted their time thinking about things we could never control, until human reason woke up and discovered, in the words of Francis Bacon, that knowledge is power, meaning not simply that the more you know, the more powerful you'll be, but rather the only thing worth knowing is what gives you power, because in fact, the test of whether you know something is whether you can have power over it. And so we have this new narrative, the emergence from irrelevant contemplation to continuous, dynamic, ceaseless activity, for the gaining of power over the earth and of ourselves, so that we may postpone death and the confrontation with the truth about our lives as long as possible. It's in itself a kind of pathology, as in a psychosis. And that is the modern age.
I'd like to shift to a topic. We don't have to talk about this for very long, but something that's very current right now with the popularity of Jordan Peterson. And that is another way that the moderns have tried to find some kind of truth in stories. And that's the sort of archetypal approach in kind of a psychological way. So you have, everybody from Jung to Joseph Campbell to Jordan Peterson talking about these things. And for whatever reason, I never found it that never really piqued my interest as a way of thinking about stories, I guess. I'm sure there's some validity to it, but why is the fascination with archetypes as a way of deriving some kind of truth from story insufficient?
Well, the reason it's attractive is that thinking about archetypes is a poor man's metaphysics. It's not an actual encounter with being and the forms of being in all their depth or fullness, but it is an encounter with a kind of form. It's the forms that constitute human life. And so it's a way of thinking through things exclusively in terms of story without entering into the full depths of the real. And so in The Vision of the Soul, I ended up including a chapter called Novel Myth Reality, an anatomy of make-believe, that tried to account for why people are so attracted to these archetypal stories. And I think I was fair. Well, our lives really do have story forms. And so when we're encountering archetypes, we're encountering universal forms of the contingent lives that we live, and presumably gaining in wisdom thereby. Certainly they suffice, as Aristotle's Ethics or MacIntyre's After Virtue will teach us. Certainly those archetypal story forms provide us the kind of forms we need to contemplate if we're going to ask questions that are ethical, meaning what is the purpose of human life? What does happiness look like? Who is the good man who is genuinely to be considered happy? And the archetypes, for the most part, are sufficient to answer those questions. So they play a very useful moral role in our instruction. Jordan Peterson's celebrity is precisely because with his Jungian psychoanalysis and in the background, he brings back archetypes to the forefront of people's thinking and says, this is a legitimate way of knowing ethical truth. And in this, he's actually not very different from the Renaissance humanists. The Renaissance humanists, though often Platonists, were Platonists in a very loose sense. They perceived rightly that to live well, to be good human beings, to engage in ethics, we need to be able to look at stories, the stories of history, the stories of literature, and to contemplate them and to distill practical wisdom from them. But they weren't generally interested in metaphysics or theology. They weren't interested in the highest truths. And in that respect, they go both aright and awry. Aright in this respect. Late scholasticism had become concerned with questions of metaphysics and theology, almost to the exclusion of recognizing that it was pursuing truths that we really need to know in order to be fulfilled, to be saved. But it began to seem like a mere academic exercise. So the Renaissance humanists were right to reject that kind of sense of theological debate for its own sake without a sense of it finally resolving into the prayer, worship, and love of God. But they were mistaken in that there is no escape from metaphysics and theology, because human beings as rational are ordered finally to a knowledge of being, to the fullness of reality. And so if we stop short thinking of human life only in terms of its archetypes, we're actually stopping short of what we nonetheless really need to be true. And that's what happens in a lot of this archetypal thinking, like Joseph Campbell, who would say, well, I don't literally believe in these things, but I do believe they're true for human experience. Well, that's not good enough for us. We don't want to believe in, to use Plato's phrase for it, we don't want to believe in noble lies. We want to see the real. And so you need to push on through that archetypal thinking to a true account of being. And you need to do it for one final reason. That's your destiny. The contemplation of God is the end of human life. That's to say, that's what we were born to do. So stopping short of it in any way is itself a tragic act that foils or frustrates the true destination of our lives and our human natures.
Let's talk about some of the other ways in which logos and mythos are interdependent and the ways in which logos can operate within mythos. There's a line in your book where you say that logos is, quote, a gloss on the reality whose existential fullness might be designated the universe of mythos, unquote. Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, that's what I've been sort of gesturing towards through much of this conversation, that logos always remains tethered to mythos, if you want to distinguish the two things, in a way that mythos isn't always tethered to logos. It's possible to get at the truth of something just by hearing the story about it and saying, no, I don't need to talk about it anymore. I understand it. I see the truth that's in the story. Whereas logos can never remain fully itself. We can never fully retain the truth as truth if we totally and permanently abstract it from the fuller story form of things. And that's because we ourselves are in our own story. God, in a sense, could do this, but to say that God could do this is basically to say God could have not created the world, but he did.
Of course, the stories we tell are themselves glosses on the story, the complete story that is our lives and history. But that's one of your points, is that, you know, history and our life is, in fact, a story, even if it's true that the stories that we tell tend to be themselves abstractions of a sort.
Yeah, I'm saying I want to distinguish to unite. Philosophers don't try to rationalize without also mythologizing. Don't try to use your reason in a way that totally abstracts it from the actual context in which it occurs, which is within a story. And you know what? To their credit, most contemporary philosophers do not try to do that. They try to understand their ideas as being conditioned by the time in which they are being conceived. The problem is that then they become mere historicists. They assume that logos, our reasoning about ideas, is always and totally reducible to the historical condition where it occurred. But that's clearly not the case, because mythology and logos are both journeys towards a truth that transcends any contingent reality. And so that's a despair into which it's not reasonable to give in. But also I guess you might say the Jungians, the Jordan Petersons, the archetypal thinkers, the people who try to do philosophy only at the level of mythos, that won't work either. Our ultimate destiny is being as a whole, and mythos and logos are two partial dimensions or elements or conditions or lenses through which we may finally look at the light of being as a whole. And so you can't do with one and not the other.
Yeah, I was struck by your claim that the philosopher actually should be a master of myths and images.
I think all philosophy is a footnote to Plato, and that's what Plato was. So QED.
Okay, so that was from episode 65 of the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'll link to that in the show notes. This next one is a clip from Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. And the title of the episode was Robert Bolt's Man for All Seasons, Christian Saint or Hero of Selfhood. This was an interview with a Thomas More scholar and a lawyer himself, Lewis Carlin, about the accuracy of the film, not so much in the events it portrays, but the portrayal of Thomas More as this hero of being true to oneself, this hero of conscience, and whether that may or may not be sort of a modern projection back onto More.
Well, you get right to the main criticism of the play, of the movie. Really serious, important scholars have roundly criticized the film as saying that it's, I guess would be that it's fairly accurate historically, but inauthentic as to the real More, and precisely because of the stand on conscience. In an article that I wrote, I think we need to push back. I think that's overstating what's happening. I think that's taking Bolt's introduction and his aims and confusing what actually happens in the play. So the scene that important scholars focus on, and this would be from John Finnis to historian John Guy, the key scene is where More is explaining to Norfolk why he will not take the oath. More is talking about apostolic succession and whether the Pope is the descendant of St. Peter, and that's something he believes. And Norfolk says, well, all this for a belief. And More, the character, says, well, it's something that I believe in. But he says, no, it's not that I believe, but that I, emphasizing the I, but that I believe. And so for these readers, these critics, the problem is that More is elevating the self as the determinant of what is true. And that is a very modern conception. You could trace from Descartes up through Camus, I suppose, who in the introduction, that's who Bolt says, where do I get off? Essentially turning Thomas More into a Camus-like hero. So that's the problem. And so you've identified that. And the question is, does the movie really show that? And I think this is worth discussing because I don't think that the play actually does that. That if you look closely, and this comes through in the play and in the movie, Bolt makes it very clear that More's stand on conscience is absolutely tied to the truth.
Yes.
The Catholic understanding of conscience is that you align your beliefs and your actions, you judge your actions according to a standard of truth, what is good and what is true. And the modern self, if this was really a modernist play, would say that the self is the determinant, is the creator of truth itself, that we decide what is true. And I don't think that Bolt, the character created by Bolt, actually does that. And we can look at certain scenes. I think a fascinating one, if you recall, there's a scene where More is being interrogated by Cromwell, Norfolk, and the Archbishop. And the question is to More, look, you say that this is capable of doubt, the issue with signing the oath. You're doubting that, but at the same time you have an undeniable duty of allegiance to the king. So weigh a doubt against an obligation and sign.
Right. A certainty, yeah.
Certainty,
yeah.
Exactly. And what's More's response here? And this is really interesting because it shows Bolt being quite a modernist, and yet look what he does. He says the speech is along the lines of, some people say the world is flat, and others say that it is round. It is matter capable of doubt. But if the king...
I wish Bolt hadn't chosen that as his example.
Well, isn't that interesting? But
Since nobody actually thought that.
Well, I think Bolt chose this for a very interesting reason, that he's thinking of the Brecht play of Galileo, where the church is painted in a terrible light, unfairly, as condemning a man for believing what is scientifically true. But what does Bolt have More say? He says, can the king's command make it flat? Can the king's command make it round? It can't. I will not sign. What More is saying here in the play is that my stand on conscience is based on what is true, what I know to be true, not merely that I hold some belief.
Right.
So I think that's one interesting example there. More having a sense in the play that he actually would have, that the stand on conscience is based on the alignment of one's beliefs and one's actions with the truth.
It seems to be kind of a multi-level thing because he, in one point in the first passage you mentioned where he says, what matters is not that I believe it, but that I believe it. He's emphasizing that it's the relevant factor is that it's his conscience, and that he can only exercise his own discernment, guided by God, of course, and ultimately cannot sort of abdicate that duty of discernment that every rational being has. On the other hand, in the passage that you just cited, the emphasis is that discernment is definitely oriented towards objective truth. The possibility that he might be getting it wrong acknowledged, but also somewhat besides the point, in a case where also relevant in a case where the church hasn't spoken definitively, or he's acknowledging the possibility that even if it has, he's misunderstanding it or something like that. But so it has this multi-level thing where he manages to both affirm the fact that it's quite important that this is his conscience, but also that it is oriented towards objective truth without sort of like making the mistake of absolutely identifying one with the other, either in the sense that one subjective conscience it sort of should rule over all, or in the sense that one could simply sort of farm out one's conscience, to the church, even though we are forming our conscience by means of the church's teachings. It's not quite true to say that we can simply say they're one and the same. I suppose that's the ideal, to be, one with the mind of Christ, but we can't just sort of presume on that all the time.
Absolutely. And Moore is is easily one of the most important writers on the question of conscience and its role as a citizen, as a statesman. In a letter that he wrote, the letter is actually attributed to his daughter, Margaret, to her sister-in-law. But it's very clear that Moore and Margaret either wrote it together or Moore wrote it himself. And it's based on a long conversation they had while he was in the Tower. And it's all based on where its role is in deciding how to act in the face of an unjust law.
So we're going to have a dramatized reading of this for our other sister podcast, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, because Gerard Wedgemer, who recommended you to me, also gave me permission to use that, or rather gave our voice actor permission to use that. So that's something that we'll probably put on Moore's feast day on June 22nd.
Well, that's amazing, because that really is it's such a deep, multi-layered, brilliant dialogue. And it brings these questions out. No one has done it better. Throughout, though, if you read it and you underline wherever conscience comes up, you will find Moore really speaks about my conscience and his conscience. So there's an undeniable aspect that Moore believes that there is this unalterable aspect of conscience, that it is your own. But again, that is very much in keeping with traditional Catholic thinking. If I might read a little bit from St. John Paul II, we're under his patronage right now. In Veritatis Splendor, St. John Paul says, according to St. Paul, conscience in a certain sense confronts man with the law, and thus becomes a witness for man, a witness of his own faithfulness or unfaithfulness with regard to the law, of his essential moral rectitude or iniquity. Conscience is the only witness, since that what takes place in the heart of a person is hidden from the eyes of everyone outside. Conscience makes its witness known only to the person himself, and in turn, only the person himself knows what his own response is to the voice of conscience. So this, we could call it a subjective aspect of conscience, is central to it, that one really does have to make up his or her own mind about what I have done and what that means. Whether that is good or bad. And in that same dialogue, Moore makes a distinction along the lines that you just made about where the church has definitively spoken. Okay, so Moore gives large scope to conscience. He makes it very clear that every man may have to follow the law at cost, but no man is bound to say that a given law is good, ever. And he definitely believed, and Jerry Wegner makes it very clear in his scholarship, is that Moore believed that the state, acting as a state, as a political body, did not have the authority. For instance, Parliament does not have the authority to coerce consciences. This is a very big point. Yes, Moore talked about an example in his discussion with Margaret where she is trying to get him to change his mind. She says, he points out that there was a time when the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was not definitively resolved. And I think he points out that St. Bonaventure was on what ended up being the wrong side of the issue. But while it was being debated, you could not blame a person for whichever stand he took, so long as it was in good faith. So that is one issue. That would be a point where Moore would say it's literally insane to believe otherwise if you have a doubt about that issue and the church has spoken definitively to say, well, no, I'm going to strike out on my own. He really wouldn't be able to understand that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that, as you sort of said, that you sign over your conscience to the church and then all of a sudden, I have no free will, I can't decide otherwise, because to a large degree, most questions aren't settled definitively because there are so many gray areas in questions.
So, implicit in what you've said, we have Moore's unwillingness seen in the play, his unwillingness to judge the consciences of others. He's very careful about that. And speaking to Norfolk, for example, you also touched on the fact that having freedom of conscience does not necessarily imply freedom from legal consequences to acting according to one's conscience if it's contrary to the law, which I'd like to return to. Let me just ask quickly, so do you think that Moore's views of conscience are more or less in line with those of St. John Henry Newman?
Yes, I do think that's right. I think that you can trace a long tradition, and they're drawing on essentially the same sources.
Is there a reason that these happen to be two English saints, or these two English saints happen to be both very well known for their speech and their stand on this particular topic? Is there something in the English tradition that accounts for that?
Okay, that's a fascinating question. I can't speak to other traditions, but for the English tradition, because of precisely this episode in English history, every serious English thinker afterwards confronted this. Up through the 20th century, so when C.S. Lewis writes a book on words and he discusses conscience, he mainly draws on that very letter that you're going to do a dramatic reading of. How do we understand conscience as an English word? Moore to help define that. Shakespeare would be another great example. I mean, we know that Shakespeare read Thomas More. We don't know everything he read, but we certainly know he read the history of Richard III because it's a primary source for his play. So in Shakespeare's play, Henry VIII, you can do a search and find out how many times the word conscience is used in that play, and you'd be astounded. Henry's use of conscience in that play is, I think, on purpose, diametrically opposed to the kind of conscience that Moore spoke about. The metaphor that Henry uses is his conscience is like a storm-tossed ship. And he needs someone to solve it, to quiet it. And that's by making things easy for him. Moore saw conscience quite differently. For Moore, the idea is you had to inform your conscience correctly.
These next clips are also from Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. Early on, we were going through the Vatican film list, which we recently completed this year. And one of the films on that list is the classic John Ford Western movie starring John Wayne, Stagecoach. And we had Anthony Esolen on to discuss the film. So you'll hear a bit of a clip from the beginning of the episode with Anthony talking about John Ford and the Western genre in general, and then some clips from later on where we just talk about, the themes of discretion, themes of patriotism, and things that come up in the Western genre and perhaps older movies in general as well, and John Ford's in particular.
I think it's useful for us to view the Western as an attempt to get a little bit outside of the social conventions of your own time, which sometimes grow hard and brittle and lose their connection with deep moral truths and become mere conventions. When you get outside of your comfortable middle-class way of life, you might be able to see these moral truths in a startling new way. And it's the West, such as it never really was in American history, not really, but the idea of the West as occupying a kind of boundary between a civilization, especially civilization that can grow stale, dead, with just the trappings of morality, but not the real thing. But the boundary between that and complete chaos, amorality and savagery, right? And Ford, it's wonderful because he's really teaching us in Stagecoach deep moral truths by giving us this kind of curveball, showing us how the moral truths are embodied in several people who would not be accepted in polite society, not because they're wicked, but the drunken doctor, the girl, the saloon girl, and John Wayne, whose relationship with law and order is a little bit of a tricky one, a difficult one. But Ford has done this deliberately, not to romanticize wickedness, but to show redemption, and redemption of characters that, as I said before, would simply be rejected out of hand. I think that John Ford was in love with goodness. And in Ford, that's as far as possible from the goody-goody, the conspicuously pious, the sickly sweet. There was very little of that in him, but a real deep affection for a sort of forthright, manly, honest, hardworking, pious in a very masculine sense, goodness. He never sneers at that kind of thing, okay? He can sneer at sanctimony, though he doesn't spend a whole lot of time doing that in his films. He will gesture that way once in a while. Hypocrisy, he lashes out against. He also saw, and this was his Catholic background speaking, he was a liberal Catholic in the days when you could be a liberal Catholic and thoroughly masculine, okay? When liberal Catholicism meant that you actually took the common good into account and you believed in the holiness of marriage precisely because you took the common good into account, all right? And the goodness of the family, the holiness of the family. Ford believed in all of that. So he's always making movies that are about not just this particular individual. He's not a guy who makes movies about loners. He makes movies about the way people come together to form a real society with their common good in mind. And he shows how that can fall apart because of human stupidity or selfishness, their pride, their avarice, their hard-heartedness. I mean, How Green Was My Valley is a movie about how a community falls apart because of those things, right? In Stagecoach, we have like the seeds of what would be a new family and maybe a new community in John Wayne and Claire Trevor, who are the outcasts, semi-outcasts from polite society, but they're not proud of their being outcasts. They're sort of resigned to it. There's nothing here that romanticizes being a saloon girl. However, there's nothing here that suggests that it is altogether a good thing to be a saloon girl or to be on the outs with the law. So we get a sense at the end of the picture that John Wayne, Claire Trevor are not just going to get married. They're going to get married and have lots of kids, and this will be the nucleus of a real society. He's always thinking about those sorts of things. Always.
It's significant that, the first time that, what sets off John Wayne's character's the Ringo kid's decision to ask Dallas to marry him is seeing her holding that other woman's baby. The look between them is not a look of eroticism. I don't know. Something in the way they look at each other, I would describe it as almost like a primal recognition of manhood and womanhood in that moment.
I watched you with that baby, that other woman's baby. You look, well, I still got a ranch across the border. That's a nice place, a real nice place. Trees, grass, water. There's a cabin half built. A man could live there. And a woman.
At the beginning of the film, Hatfield singles out Mrs. Mallory as an angel in the jungle. Ringo, I believe at one point, I forget the context, describes Dallas as a woman like that, almost implying the same thing. Here's my question. Does Ringo know that Dallas is a prostitute?
Well, there is a moment in the film when they're first sitting next to each other, he says,
"Why do you look at me like that?"
Just trying to remember. Ain't I seen you someplace before, man?
No, you haven't.
I wish I had, though.
So I think that you could legitimately read it both ways, but I do think that his character is exalted a little bit more, and I think that it's more interesting to read it as, yeah, he knows who she is,
right,
and he knows all he wants to know, as he says later on.
He knows, but again, there's this wonderful, and I wish people would practice this a little bit more in our time, wonderful reticence. Okay, I mean, sometimes it's a great charity to people to keep your mouth shut, to not say, okay, well, now everybody has to get in a circle and we've just got to all talk this out. Often in my life, I've seen, I've seen people begin with antagonism and by dialogue end with perfect enmity. You can just start talking and talk yourself into complete enmity. As I said, some things are best left unsaid, and therefore on the way to being forgiven. Don't tell me. Don't have to tell me. I don't need those words in my ears and in my memory. Don't have to tell me. I'm not your confessor anyway. Beautiful. I mean, after all, would any of us actually like to have to speak his worst sins in public and not to a private confessor? Although these days in our
certainly
time,
not.
I'm amazed from social media. I'm amazed at the number of saints among whom I live who are just simply outraged at the worst sins in the world, which are always other people's sins, and seem completely blithe about their own. Unbelievable. I didn't know I dwelt among such holiness.
That's right. That's right. I think that self-accusation is something that we all could benefit from right now, but some of us perhaps maybe more than others. In any case.
And not self-accusation of this sort, right? Where you say, oh my gosh, I am so sorry for X, when in fact you didn't commit X. X is not your sin. You're just appropriating X, which is somebody else's sin. You don't feel bad about it on your own account because you never committed it. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. But when actually the rottenness that you do every day, that just slides right by. Yeah, I'm amazed. Why, gosh, if we go at this rate, well, everybody be wearing halos. Maybe some people are wearing halos right now as leftovers from the fires they're setting.
Yeah. We mentioned before that, or I mentioned before that I saw this as kind of a patriotic film because in the opening shots, we have an American flag being raised, the bugle call, but then throughout there is the characters talk about America. I think about the banker in particular, America for Americans. And so we see how disingenuous he is in that. But I get the sense that this is an authentically patriotic film. It's not one that romanticizes the American project. It recognizes the difficulties inside of there. As you pointed out, Tony, even some of the racial tensions and how we might be able to get past that. And I thought, watching this, it was such a breath of fresh air, especially in this current climate. And I also found myself thinking, man, this is precisely the kind of film that a leftist ideologue would totally try to, claim as their own and contort to match their message, because it is a film, I think, that is concerned about, well, let's say it, diversity. It's a buzzword now, but this is a really eclectic bunch of people who run into other eclectic bunches of people. We've got the Mexican innkeeper who's married to an Apache woman
who betrays him.
Right, totally. I'll just say one more thing, that in all of this, even in the moments where it seems like Ford is making a critique, I never get the sense of any resentment or like chip on the shoulder or angst, and certainly not of a lack of love for the country.
Except maybe where bankers are concerned.
Ford loved America. He loved America. He did patriotic filming during the war for the war effort that he was very proud of.
The Battle of Midway.
Yeah.
In fact, the guy who the screenwriter for this film also co-wrote the documentary The Battle of Midway that Ford directed during the war.
Right. Yeah. Ford and Capra, Howard Hawks, I mean, they all believed that America, with all her sins, all her failing to live up to her ideals, America was a great nation and offered great hope and great goodness to people. He was never motivated by the small and petty sins, the reductive sins like envy or resentment. I don't think they were in his constitution at all. If he was angry at somebody, get into a fist fight with him and then it'd be over, not to seethe and harbor a grudge like that. The Long Gray Line is, as I said, a tribute to West Point, but more a tribute to what America is all about. And that America includes people from all kinds of places, right? In the Long Gray Line, we've got the first graduate of West Point from the Philippines, okay? And that's made a point of, right? The Philippines had become an American dependency and would be set free, right? I mean, this was what, in the early part of Long Gray Line, we're talking about World War I. Yeah, the idea that America was evil from the start is, to him, would be simply incomprehensible. It would be sick. Where do you go elsewhere? Show me the perfect nation. Show me the sinless culture. They don't exist. I mean, so Ford was a grown-up who made movies for grown-ups that children could watch. And the more childlike you were as a grown-up, the better you were for understanding them. But he made grown-ups for grown-ups. And if we're not grown-ups, we're not going to like the movies of John Ford. If we're political ideologues, we're not going to get him because we're not grown-up. Mm-hmm. We're simplistic little snotty, resentful children. If you're that sort, don't watch John Ford. Ford, in some of his movies, is clear that he has sympathy for the Indians. That doesn't come across exactly in this movie. But then this movie isn't really about the Indians. You know, the treatment of the Indians, they're stealing their land and so forth. And if you're not going to be a grown-up, go do something else. We're grown-ups. We're watching a movie for grown-ups. You don't want to be part of the conversation. Go play tiddlywinks. Go do whatever it is that 40-year-old brats do, okay? But don't bother us. We're grown-ups.
Okay, so back to the Catholic Culture podcast for these last clips. These are from episode 73, St. John Henry Newman's Aesthetics, an interview with an Oratorian priest, Father Guy Nichols, who wrote a book called Unearthly Beauty about the aesthetics of Newman. And there's going to be a few clips. In the first one, we talk about Newman's sort of unique concepts of real versus unreal, his view on the dangers of separation of sentiment and action, a bit about how people perceive Newman as a person, his personal beauty. Also, a very interesting segment on the important role that music had in the oratory, not only in Newman's time, but going back to the founder of the oratory, St. Philip Neri. Newman speaks of things being real or unreal. And there's even a line, a line in the book from, maybe it was one of his friends, I forget, saying that for Newman, it was perhaps less damning to say something that something was unreal as opposed to that it was untrue. So what does that mean, and how does that connect to his views on beauty?
That's a very good question, because it really gets to the heart of the matter of what Newman means by reality and truth, because those two, in Newman's own understanding, are almost impossible to separate from each other. And that's why it is that you can actually quite authentically, in translating, when you can use the words truth and reality interchangeably. So when he famously, of course, composed an epitaph for his memorial stone in the cloisters at the Oratory in Birmingham, he had in mind to inscribe on that stone, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, which, of course, first sight you would say is from out of shadows and images into the truth. But in fact, it's just as valid a translation. In many ways, it's more appropriate to Newman to say from shadows and images into reality. I think that the reason for that is because for Newman, truth was never just an abstract concept. It was always something that directly and fundamentally had an impact on the individual person. That God, in fact, when we say God is truth, he is the fullness of reality. And in that reality, he makes a significant effect upon the one who approaches him. So that the truth of God is encountered precisely in understanding that he really is. And that I think is what Newman means by talking about reality. And therefore, this kind of translates into a whole language of our human interaction with Almighty God. And that when we interact with God, we're not simply doing so as with a being that we can have an intellectual grasp of, but rather with a being who confronts us with the challenge of his love for us and his desire for us to come to him, which involves, of course, as this is what Newman understands, of course, from his own life's story, which involves a great deal of serious undertaking. For Newman, there was no question at all that you could simply just make an intellectual assent to God from the first moment you understood what the word God meant. You had to come to a full understanding of the reality of that by sometimes a very arduous journey. And it wasn't just an intellectual one, but also, of course, a moral one. You can't just simply come to a relationship with God by recognizing that he exists. You've got to know what he has done for you and for the whole race, and what the consequences of his action are for what we must do. I think that's the reality that he's understanding.
So how does this reality versus unreality relate to beauty?
That's a very important point, of course. I think that for Newman, it's a question of how beauty will either move us on or draw us into some kind of world, an inner stasis, if you like, of just simply contemplating beauty for its own sake. He does talk about this in an important sermon, actually, that you yourself picked up the reference to, which is the sermon on the danger of accomplishments, where he talks about the danger that we can take so much delight in the faculties that we have been given and in those things that we can produce from them, which will themselves arouse certain kinds of emotional responses, that we can rest in those, but not actually move forward into the action, which in fact is what we should be doing anyway. As he puts it, we could, for instance, read a novel, and the novel could be full of very edifying principles and characters who act extremely well, but the reading of it could just be simply an act of purely internalized enjoyment and having no consequence at all on how we actually then go on to conduct our lives. And I think he sees that as a danger, as a form of unreality. So the reality is all to do with how we act, how we are changed in order to act and to act well.
I was very struck by this sermon, and I think it made me understand Plato, some of Plato's warnings about art a little better. I don't know if Plato was saying exactly the same thing, but I think there's something in common there. I see it in myself very much, not so much with music, I am a musician, but with stories and with philosophy, with ideas, with the indulging of beautiful ideas without acting on them. Yes. He talks about how God gave us this faculty of moving from sentiments and ideas to action. And so if we habituate ourselves to disconnecting the two, then what happens when we actually need to act? We may feel the necessary sentiments and then not act. And he connects this to effeminacy, which was also very striking and something I had never heard before, the disconnect between sentiment and having noble sentiments and actually acting. So I'll quote him here. He says that poetry and music, quote, are especially likely to make us unmanly if we are not on our guard, as exciting emotions without ensuring correspondent practice, and so destroying the connection between feeling and acting. For I here mean by unmanliness the inability to do with ourselves what we wish, the saying fine things, and yet lying slothfully on our couch, as if we could not get up, though we ever so much wished it.
Yes.
Very striking and, for me, convicting.
Yes, that's right. He's always, of course, extremely concerned about the dangers of intellectual achievements and intellectual enjoyments when divorced from any sense of personal engagement and commitment. And he sees, I think, that it's a danger that particularly likely to befall those who have very strongly developed faculties of that kind. So, as I say, those who are very well skilled in music and in art and in the use of language, they can, in fact, just simply take so much enjoyment in those things themselves and in producing some kind of effect or some particular kind of perfection. Again, coming back to that idea of a perfection which leads nowhere other than itself, but doesn't lead beyond.
It's remarkable. We have so many warnings about in the early church about the theater and, different art forms and things like that on a moral level. Here we have a saint who was an accomplished artist himself. He was a poet. He was a novelist, also a accomplished amateur musician. And here he's speaking about, under the assumption that the art he's discussing is actually inculcating noble sentiments. So he's even setting aside in this sermon novels that are immoral, for example. He's speaking only of the dangers of good novels, so to speak.
Oh, definitely, yes. I mean, that's the whole point he's making. I mean, in a sense, he thinks the point isn't worth arguing about immoral art of any kind, because it should be obvious to anybody, and certainly to his congregation.
Yes,
it would have been. They wouldn't have needed any persuading about that. But of course, the point he's trying to make is that don't just think that because you avoid any directly and deliberately immoral forms of art, that thereby you have avoided all danger. And that's not because art itself is misleading in itself, but rather because we can be misled by certain assumptions that we make in encountering it. That's the point that he wants to make. As always, with Newman, he's trying to go into a deeper level of the human psyche than perhaps most of those whom he was preaching to would normally have gone. But he does it in such a way that they can easily grasp exactly the point of what he's saying. So much so, in fact, that very many people commented that when they were present at his sermons, they felt as though he was speaking to each one individually himself, which is a most interesting observation. And in fact, always a very good sign that the preacher has an extremely accurate grasp of the human soul.
Yes, and of course, it's also a sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit, as in, Pentecost.
Yeah, well, of course, that's certainly true, of course. But obviously, as you know, I mean, grace, even the grace of the Holy Spirit works through nature.
Yes.
And what Newman is doing, of course, is he's applying all the gifts that God has given to him in terms of his penetrating intellect and his powerful rhetorical gift in order to reach the innermost hearts and minds of those who hear him, with a view to changing their ways of life and their understanding of where their life should be taking them.
Let's go ahead and start talking about Newman's personal life and his relation to beauty in concrete ways. Well, actually, if we could just say something quickly about Newman's personal beauty, which you discuss in the first chapter, of his comportment, his voice, his speaking style, and the impression that made on others, because I think that's worth talking about.
Yes, it is, because it's something which I think probably came across to people in different ways. One of the things which I've been interested in always in the imagery surrounding Newman, his iconography, if you like, I should say, is the way in which there are so many different styles of picturing him. And I contrast, for instance, the famous Richmond drawing, which is probably the most famous of all the drawings. It was made in 1844, so just shortly before he became a Catholic. And that's the kind of heroic sort of Newman. And he was compared by one of his brothers-in-law, one of the Moseley brothers, to Caesar as having the bearing that inspired that kind of hero worship that one learns about in the ancient world with someone like Julius Caesar. And I think that that's probably what inspired that particular view that you get from Richmond's drawing. And that's almost the same in the very fine marble bust by his old school friend, Richard Westmacott, which is the original is in the Oratory in Birmingham as well. I think that gives a very similar kind of impression of Newman, sort of idealized Newman, but idealized not just simply to try and make out that he was the most handsome man in the 19th century or anything like that, but rather to express through a certain kind of beautifully proportioned features, one who was able to inspire a great deal of love and a longing to be imitators of him and to share certain aspects of his view. So, I mean, Newman was obviously seen as a great leading figure in the 19th century, both when he was an Anglican in his preaching in St. Mary's, and then also, of course, obviously as a Catholic and as the founder of the Oratory. He inspired many men to follow him in his religious ways. And then on the other hand, you get an image like others, like there's the spy cartoon of the 1850s, which shows him as a very much more bent, stooped sort of man. And indeed, that stoop was part of his character. He's described, again, I think, by his brother-in-law Mosley as walking along in a rather stooped way, very fast, as though with intent on a world quite beyond where he happens to be. And again, also very beautifully summed up by Copleston, who was the head of the college, Oriel College, when Newman was newly elected there, and who said, seeing Newman walking out in, I think, Christchurch Meadows one day, said, "Ah, yes, numquam minus solus quam cum solus," never less alone than when he is on his own. Again, this idea that Newman was somehow wrapped up in the affairs of another world so much that he didn't seem to be fully engaged with the world around him. And I think that idea, again, this urgent speed to his walking, the slightly stooped posture, I think, again, shows that the way that people perceived him very often led them to portray him in slightly different ways as well.
So we're touching on the beauty of his holiness as well there.
Yes, I think so. And I think that obviously came across in different ways. That's interesting, actually, that the beauty of his holiness is something that is commented on by several people. And generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that they are female commentators. So people like Maria Giberne, who was, of course, a lifelong friend of his, and some of the other ladies who came to visit him commented very much on the beauty of holiness that radiated from him, and obviously must have lent a certain kind of luster to his appearance as well, even if he wasn't necessarily the kind of Apollo figure that perhaps the Richmond might suggest. But it does represent a real aspect of Newman, which is the point, which obviously must have been seen by those who commented on it. I think that you do get the sense of the beauty of holiness in the way that certain artists have tried to capture that image. The earnestness combined with an obvious sense of deep kind of reflection of the beauty of God through his features. And of course, not only that, but also through his voice. I think it's important. We can't so easily understand that simply because, alas, we have no recordings of his voice at all. We have plenty of pictures of what he looked like, and we also have plenty of descriptions of his voice and the quality of his voice. But unfortunately, we can't get any closer to it than just those descriptions. But it was quite clear that the quality of his voice was such that people found profoundly moving and pleasing.
And his preaching style was noted for having a soft intensity to it, wasn't it?
That's right, yes. He didn't generally raise his voice. He spoke quite quietly. And again, I think this must have added to that impression that he was speaking to each individual person in the congregation beneath him. I say beneath because obviously the pulpit is quite high, raised up in St. Mary's. If you've ever been there, you'll probably know. But that, I think, must have increased that impression that he was speaking to each person individually who was there. And of course, obviously, he would have a pretty well, I mean, given that he was raised up quite high in the pulpit, he'd have a more or less uninterrupted line of vision to virtually everybody there. I think that it would be almost certain that he would be able to see the faces of everybody there. And more importantly, perhaps, I think most of the people there, by far the majority of people there, would have had a clear vision of his face too, combined with his voice. That must have been quite a strong impression of direct personal intercommunication, which of course is something, again, which he thought extremely important to aim at throughout his life. So yes, he didn't ever kind of address crowds in that sort of way. At least, I mean, he did obviously have to address crowds on several occasions, but delivering lectures, of course. But when he did so, he never did so in any sense as just looking at an indiscriminate group of people in front of him, but always with a strong awareness of the individuals who were there. And as far as possible, he would like to know as much about them as he could. So obviously he was able to do that when he was preaching at St. Mary's. He would know the parishioners very well because he obviously made a point of being pastorally very deeply engaged with them. But also, of course, a lot of the young men who came from the colleges, even though he wasn't necessarily preaching to them a lot of the time, they would, I think many of them would make themselves known to him if they possibly could, because he obviously had made a great impression on the colleges, given that we know that the masters of several of the Oxford colleges deliberately moved the dinner hour in their colleges in order to coincide with the evening service at St. Mary's, thereby to prevent their undergraduates from going to listen to Mr. Newman preaching in St. Mary's. So we can see, therefore, that the impression that he made on the young men of Oxford was quite an intense one, and one, therefore, that many of his opponents, religious opponents, must have thought was very important to try and neutralize in that way.
In your book, there is a quote from Newman: "The little oratory is intended as a recreation, hence music has so much to do with it. It is, I think, an outbidding of the world, in all ways a doing what the world does on Christian principles." Can you describe what a little oratory session, for lack of a better word, would look like under Newman?
Yes. What he would do is he would employ his fathers, the small community who worked with him, among whom there were always good musicians. You may also remember that one of the things that he said while he was still in Rome and writing back to some of his friends who were still in England and hoping to join him was, you must look out for more musicians. We need more singers. We need more people who can play musical instruments, because that's so much an important part of the oratory. So that one of the things he did once he got back to England was to do precisely that, to use the talents of his friends to play music, not of a very sophisticated level. One of the things that, as I say, he experienced in Rome was the exercises of the oratory there, which he was disappointed with at first because he thought it was rather too much, concentrating on just musical performance and very little on the instructional side. What he wanted to do, you see, was to make music an integral part of what would be not merely entertaining, but would use the entertainment as a means of making whatever instruction he was giving more penetrating and more attractive. It was, to use a word that, as I mentioned before, a word that one of St. Philip's own followers, Anerio, had used in an introduction to a set of music that he'd written in honor of St. Philip. It was allurement, adescamento is the word he used. And it's that idea of music as an allurement, as something which you draw people with through its beauty and make them therefore amenable to the truth that you then go on to expound to them. And of course, to draw them on, through drawing them to the truth, to draw them further on also to their own commitment to a life dedicated to the service of the truth, the life of the sacraments, all of the moral life of the church, seen as a way in which we come closer to our calling to be remade in the image of God. So that was what he was looking at. That's what he was trying to do. And so in his musical oratories, obviously he would have to shape this, as he realized when he came back to England, according to the needs of where he happened to be. So in the very earliest instances, of course, he was in Maryvale, which is actually a large house outside the city of Birmingham. I mean, nowadays it's in a suburb of Birmingham, but when Newman was there, not far off 200 years ago, really, when you think about it, it was still out in the countryside. So it didn't have a large congregation or anything like that. So there wasn't very much scope for that sort of congregation. Then he eventually moved into the centre of Birmingham to a very, very poor part of the city called Derrit End. And there was very little opportunity for anything very elaborate, because the people that he was serving were so poor that their needs were just overwhelming. And he and his companions spent all their time and energy just simply trying to provide for their physical as well as their basic pastoral needs. And so education of the most basic kind is one of the things that they turned their attention to, as well as, of course, other forms of practical assistance and benefit as well. So it wasn't really until they moved eventually to Edgbaston in 1851, 1852, that he was at last living in a part of Birmingham where it was possible to form that kind of group of people who would be interested in music and find in music something that would draw them deeper into the mysteries of the faith, which is not to say he found himself in an entirely sophisticated part of the world. There was no part of the city of Birmingham that didn't have a lot of difficult problems and many poor people to serve. And he never at any time abandoned or neglected those. And I think it's important to emphasize that, because obviously we're used to thinking of Newman in terms of the influence that he had on many of the intellectual people and on the children of his fellow converts in his school and then the university and such like. But in fact, we can easily overlook what is not necessarily so obvious to us after more than a century away from this time, that he was also serving the needs of the poor as well. So all that he did, and this is the point that it comes back to really, was shaped by the needs of the people he served at the time. And this didn't necessarily mean that he was able to offer a very sophisticated musical program. And that's one of the reasons why he looked out for, in the 1850s particularly, he looked out for popular tunes. It's something, again, we were talking about yesterday, that he looked for popular tunes, which as an Anglican, he would actually have positively despised and been horrified at. But as a Catholic priest looking after the needs of so many people who were very poor and who weren't sophisticated in many ways, he found that it was one of the best ways of drawing them in and helping to move them into a deeper appreciation of the truths and the practice of the faith. So I think that's the way that I'd want to characterize it. It wasn't necessarily very sophisticated what he was doing in his early years as an oratorian. That probably didn't increase until the 1860s, when, as I mentioned before, he was running the school largely for the children of his friends, his fellow converts. And so he had a growing body of boys to educate, and particularly, of course, to educate musically wherever possible. And that led to a much more sophisticated kind of program of music, which, again, we've already been talking about. And, of course, Newman had the opportunity, once again, to pick up his own violin and to reacquaint himself with so much of the musical repertoire that he'd known as a young man, and to introduce the boys to that repertoire as well.
All right, everybody. Like I said, I'm linking to all of the original episodes that these clips came from in the show notes, and I hope you'll check some of them out if you feel so inspired. And, again, hopefully I will have a new interview for you within a couple weeks and get back to a more regular schedule. Things have been a bit crazy on the personal front, so hoping to get back with an interview with Holly Ordway. Her book is really wonderful, so I'm excited to talk to her about that. All right, everybody, God bless you, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.